Hello and welcome to our webinar about Doncaster Sheffield Airport's Airspace Change Proposal. This webinar is part of the formal public consultation about our proposals to reinstate controlled airspace and introduce arrival and departure routes needed for the airport to reopen safely and bring passenger and cargo flights back to the region. During this webinar, we'll talk you through the arrival and departure route changes being proposed so you can understand how they might affect you. This particular webinar is not covering the proposed controlled airspace volumes. That detail will be covered during our specific sessions for general aviation. If you are interested in that, you can find the details and times of these on our website. At any time throughout this session, you can use the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll have some time at the end to answer those questions. You'll also be able to find a recording of this webinar on Doncaster Sheffield Airport's Consultation website, so you can revisit this information in slower time. You can also find links to all consultation documentation there, and most importantly, please make sure you share your views on our proposals via the online survey, and the link to that survey is available at the end of the presentation. The reopening of the airport is the centrepiece of South Yorkshire Airport City, a major regional growth programme which is designed to restore aviation services and unlock thousands of new jobs across advanced manufacturing, engineering, logistics and green technologies. It's been delivered through a partnership between national government, the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority and the City of Doncaster Council. This ACP is a core part of the overall programme, with some airlines being very clear they won't operate from the airport until a safe and efficient airspace structure is in place to support their commercial flights. The process for changing the airspace is known as CAP 1616. That's just the document number for that particular process. There are 7 stages to CAP 1616, and the CAA monitors our progress against the requirements of the airspace change process at key defined points, which are called gateways. There's a timeline on the following page which shows the history of the airspace change at the airport and also where we are currently within the 7 stages. So the airport closed in November 2022 after the previous airport operator withdrew, and at that time the CAA began the process to remove the airspace and all the associated flight procedures. In September 2024, we signalled our intent to begin the airspace change process, although it was in September 2025 that the CAA actually removed the previous controlled airspace and flight procedures which had previously supported the airport operation. We began stage 1 of the CAP 1616 airspace change process just in November 2025, and we've already passed stages 1 and 2 by May 2026, and in July this year the CAA approved us to be able to begin this public consultation. After this consultation, we'll incorporate all your feedback into the final proposal, which is planned to be submitted to the CAA in January next year, so a decision can be made by them by the summer. The airport is expected to reopen in 2027 with some freight movements which don't require the full airspace implementation, but we do expect the full implementation of the change in spring 2028 to begin commercial passenger operations. The gap between the CAA decision in the middle of 2027 and full implementation in spring 2028 is to provide the time to enable the airport to discharge all of the planning conditions that are associated with the CAA airspace change decision. These are things such as training of all the air traffic controllers. That's not just Doncaster Airport's air traffic controllers, that's the training of air traffic controllers at NATS who handle all the flights across all of UK airspace. Here's a bit of background information. This slide shows you the latest information on the number of expected scheduled arrivals and departures for the full year of implementation in 2028 through to 10 years after implementation in 2037. These arrivals and departures will either be passenger or cargo flights. Now, forecasting like this is not an exact science, and our forecast will continue to evolve as we move closer towards full implementation. An air transport movement is a commercial arrival or a departure, and our main priority is to attract passenger and cargo operations to the airport. But there could be non-scheduled movements at the airports, such as business jets or other non-commercial general aviation activities, even military aircraft. However, those aircraft are not included into our forecasts owing to greater uncertainty. There are no current plans to have a flying club based at the airport. I'll now tell you how aircraft could arrive and depart from the airport in the future. We've got one runway at the airport, and that can be operated in either of two directions. The direction that aircraft depart or arrive depends entirely on the wind direction, as aircraft will always take off and land into the wind. The prevailing wind direction in the Doncaster area is from the southwest, and this means that aircraft will take off and land towards the south approximately 60 to 70% of the year, and the other 30 to 40% of the year, aircraft will take off and land towards the north. After takeoff, the departures will route towards two existing points in the sky before then flying on towards their destination. These 2 points in the sky are currently called Upton out to the west and Rogag out to the east. Now, their exact positions might actually change slightly, which will result in a change to their name when the routes eventually go live, but they'll be well above 7,000 feet by these points, and it won't affect the route centre lines we show you today. We're just saying this, but for the purposes of this consultation, we'll refer to those existing names. When arriving, no matter which runway direction is in use, we expect the main flow of arrivals to be from the southwest of the airport. This is because they'll be positioned here by NATS air traffic control at around 9,000 feet before being positioned by Doncaster air traffic control to land on the appropriate final approach. Final approach is that final part of the flight when aircraft are lined up with the runway centerline and they're undertaking a final descent to land. To help aircraft land at the airport, we'll have a navigation aid called an instrument landing system, and there'll also be satellite-based navigation alternatives available. We'll now talk you through the departure routes. We're proposing to have two main departure routes off each runway end, one towards Rogag and one towards Upton. And they'll use a type of navigation called performance-based navigation, or PBN. This is effectively satellite navigation rather than using navigation aids on the ground. The majority of departures will all follow these route centre lines, but some might be vectored by air traffic control. Vectoring is where air traffic control are providing manual instructions to the aircraft and they're not following a specific route centre line. This vectoring could be required for departures that aren't able to fly the PBN departure routes, or aircraft may need to take arrivals off their arrival flight paths if there are multiple arrivals at the same time or they need to be positioned away from departing aircraft. The following pages contain maps which show where the departure route centre lines are going to be, along with information on how often we think those routes are going to be used. The number of flights on these pictures are based on a summer day when the airport is expected to be at its busiest. However, there will be variation on those numbers throughout the year. This image illustrates the departure flight paths when aircraft are taking off towards the south, which is approximately 60 to 70% of the time. One of our proposed departure routes is quite different to the departure route that used to be there when the airport was last operational in 2022. That is the departure that turns left towards Upton. The departure that turns to the right and then left down towards Rogag is very similar to what used to be there previously, whereas this left-hand turn is a completely new route that allows aircraft to climb to the east of the airport, away from the densely populated areas to the west. This also reduces the amount of controlled airspace the airport needs. The type of navigation being used on these routes is very precise, especially on that left turn departure route towards Upton, so you can expect aircraft to be very precisely following that flight path. The departure route down towards Rogag is not quite as accurate, so there'll be slightly more dispersion on that route centre line. On this image, the end of the blue lines indicates approximately where we expect the vast majority of aircraft to be above 7,000 feet, but then the dotted line shows their flight path you can expect to see be followed from that point. We expect about a 50-50 split in terms of the numbers of aircraft using each of these departure routes, and on current forecasts, in 2037, there could be in the region of 14 departures a day. That's 14 departures a day on each of these routes. This image shows the departure flight paths being proposed when aircraft are taking off towards the north, which is about 30 to 40% of the time. These routes are different to what used to be in operation in 2022. Again, this is to allow aircraft to climb towards the less populated areas to the east of the airport and to reduce the amount of controlled airspace required out to the west. Both these departure routes follow the same path before they split, and we expect aircraft to be at 7,000 feet before these two departure flight paths diverge from each other. These flight paths use a very precise type of navigation, so you can expect to see aircraft follow these flight paths very accurately. This turn to the right is the tightest turn we can design. We can't turn the aircraft any more steeply in order to keep the route west of Westward Side. Equally, we can't go much further out to the east as we need to keep the amount of controlled airspace to the minimum necessary. On average, we expect aircraft to be about 6,000 feet or higher as they overfly westward side, but aircraft performance does vary quite significantly. Some aircraft could be a little lower than that, and a lot of aircraft could be very much higher than that. Again, there's about a 50-50 split between the two departure routes, but these two departure routes are identical until the point at which they do split. So on this initial first blue flight path, we're expecting around 28 departures a day by 2037. We'll now talk you through the arrivals. For arrivals, we expect the majority of aircraft to be positioned onto the satellite-guided flight paths, which guide aircraft round and down onto final approach. So these aircraft will be positioned by air traffic control towards a specific point that forms part of the route. The actual full route is much longer and starts overhead the airport, but that will really only be flown in unusual circumstances, and we'll show you those flight paths in a later slide. Any aircraft that aren't able to follow the flight paths will be vectored. A reminder, that's when air traffic control are manually directing the flights, and this creates a much bigger spread of traffic over the ground. Last time the airport was operational in 2022, there were no satellite arrival flight paths that were used to position aircraft onto final approach. Everything was vectored by air traffic control, which created quite a broad swathe across which aircraft could fly. In our proposals, aircraft will be much more accurately following a route centreline, greatly reducing the number of people affected by aircraft noise. About 60 to 70% of the time, arrivals will land towards the south, and in this runway configuration, aircraft will be able to approach final approach from either the east or the west side. Again, they will enter the airspace from the southwest at approximately 9,000 feet, where air traffic control will either position them to the east or the west of the airport, depending on what else is going on in the airspace at that time. We think air traffic control will most frequently position aircraft to one of the waypoints along these PBN arrival routes, and from that point, aircraft will very accurately follow those flight paths and descend continuously with idle thrust to be as quiet as possible as they turn round onto final approach. So before they're on their route centre lines, there will be a broader swathe of arrivals before they approach the more narrow flight path. By 2028, we're forecasting about 28 flights a day, and we think the majority of these will be positioned to the west of the airports. So we're predicting 18 of those 28 flights to the west and 10 to the east. We can't completely avoid overflight of Kroll and moorends because we have to keep the amount of controlled airspace to the minimum necessary, and if we extend that route it would require more controlled airspace out to the north. Some arrivals may not always be able to fly these flight paths, so they will require to be vectored by air traffic control, and therefore you will experience some overflight in areas not directly underneath the route centre lines. The other 30 to 40% of the time, arrivals will be landing towards the north. In this configuration, we're only proposing to have a flight path that joins final approach from the east side of the airport. Approaching from this side was similar to what was in place when the airport was last operational. Again, most flights will enter Doncaster's airspace from the southwest at around 9,000 feet, and from there they'll be positioned onto the accurate flight path shown in blue. We've designed it with the tightest radius of turn available to try and reduce overflight of Retford and Worksop wherever possible, whilst keeping the volume of controlled airspace to a minimum. This route could see up to 28 arrivals a day by 2037. Again, not all aircraft will always be on the route centre lines, so you may experience overflights in areas not directly underneath the centre lines. As I mentioned, those slides so far have not shown the full arrival route centre lines because we don't expect the full routes to be flown very frequently at all. However, please be aware that in the event aircraft need to hold before landing, there is a holding pattern above the airport available where aircraft can hold from 4,000 feet above the ground and upwards. From there, if there was ever radar unavailable for air traffic control, aircraft would fly the full procedure as shown on these images here. For this eventuality, we have both satellite-based and ground-based flight paths. There are no records on the frequency of the use of the overhead hold when Doncaster Airport was previously operational. However, from analysis of radar data from that last summer in 2022, there were only 4 holding patterns flown in the entire summer, and this was just from one single arriving flight. We therefore expect that the use of the hold will be a rare event, for example, in periods of radar outages for air traffic control. We'll now summarise the benefits and impacts of our proposals. The airspace change process requires us to develop a number of different options and assess the benefits and impacts of those options, and then try and pick the optimal solution. In preparation for this consultation, we took a very detailed assessment of two potential options and we compared them both to the without airspace change baseline scenario. What we mean by this is we are comparing our options against what is there today, i.e. no flights to and from the airport. So just to confirm, we compare our proposals to today's scenarios of no flight paths, no controlled airspace and no noise from aircraft. There are specific assessment categories and the next slide provides a very high-level summary of the outcomes of that assessment for just our proposed option that we're consulting on now. If you want to see how the other option performed, you can see the full options appraisal document which is available on our consultation website. It's important to note that this assessment is required to be undertaken across 10 years from 2028 out to 2037. And because we're comparing to a without airspace change baseline for when there are no flights arriving and departing, the majority of the categories show that there is an impact from the change, as you'd expect. What the assessment doesn't reflect is the full long-term benefits of opening the airport, and those benefits will actually be realised over the next 25 years and beyond, involving boosting the local economy and creating job opportunities across aviation, logistics, engineering, construction and local businesses. And remember, the airport already has planning permission to operate, and those permissions already place a limit on the number of flights. This assessment only considers the changes as a result of the position of the flight paths or the controlled airspace. As explained, this is just a high-level summary to give an overview, and more details can be found in our consultation document and also the full options appraisal document. From a noise perspective, the introduction of flights will obviously mean there are increases in noise for some areas. If you look at the Communities and Local Area Interest document, you can see the different noise contours and whether your area falls within one of those contours, and there's also information on the overall population numbers affected by noise. We're only expecting the introduction of flights to the airport to have a negligible impact on air quality. This is because the airspace change process dictates that it's only that portion of the flight below 1,000 feet that is considered to have an effect on air quality. For example, the airspace change process doesn't take into account the operations at the airport itself, or for example the increase in road traffic from cargo and passengers travelling to and from the airport. As the controlled airspace and flight paths will enable more aircraft to operate to and from the airport, there will of course be an associated increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and you'll find more information about that in the Communities and Local Area Interest document. In terms of tranquility, government policy requires us to consider overflight of national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty below 7,000 feet. There'll be no overflight to any national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty as a result of this airspace change. We've done a specialist habitat assessment which indicated there's not expected to be any significant effects on designated habitats, flora or fauna. And in terms of capacity and economic impacts, reopening the airport will enable over 1,000 passenger flights carrying over 150,000 passengers and over 800 cargo flights by 2028. By 2037, that is estimated to increase to over 8,000 passenger flights carrying over 1 million passengers and over 4,000 cargo flights. Therefore, the introduction of flights to the airport has strong economic benefits. We also have to assess the resilience of the operation, and we've included procedures to account for navigation aid failure and also alternative procedures for any aircraft who aren't equipped with the latest technology to fly the satellite-based flight paths. Now, the introduction of controlled airspace may impact general aviation users such as private light aircraft, gliders, paragliders, parachutists, microlights, balloons, helicopters, even the military. This is because general aviation typically prefers to operate outside controlled airspace. They can operate inside controlled airspace subject to speaking to air traffic control, but not all aircraft are, for example, equipped with radios, meaning they're unable to speak to air traffic control and therefore have to avoid the airspace, which could result in longer journeys. There is information about those impacts within the Aviation Interest document. There's nothing that we're proposing that would result in any additional cost to airlines beyond their normal operating costs. And as you can imagine, there are significant deployment, infrastructure and operational costs for the airport to implement an air traffic control service. We've not identified any safety risks that are considered to be intolerable, and we expect the proposed design to integrate with neighbouring airports and the wider NATS airspace. And we're also ensuring the design is compatible with the future modernised airspace in the surrounding region, as there is a long-term project to redesign all the airspace across Leeds, Doncaster, Manchester, Liverpool and East Midlands region from 2031 onwards. As part of our appraisals, we also have to try and monetise as much of those benefits and costs for the categories wherever it's possible to do so. So what this means is the noise, greenhouse gas emissions, fuel burn, economic benefits and operational costs, they're all monetised and work out whether there's an overall benefit or disbenefit from the airspace change. Overall, this monetised assessment has shown a £542 million benefit over 10 years for the proposed option. But it's important to note that this assessment does not take into account the full long-term benefits of reopening the airport. Those benefits show that reopening the airport could boost the economy by approximately £5 billion by 2050, as well as providing wider economic benefits of around £2 billion over the same time. Furthermore, the plans are forecast to support thousands of jobs, with estimates suggesting more than 5,000 people can be directly employed in opportunities across aviation, logistics, engineering, construction and local business. This presentation does just provide an overview, so we really encourage you to visit our website and read the consultation material. We have a range of materials available, from a short, easy-to-read summary to more detailed technical documents for those of you who are interested in that level of detail. You can also attend one of our in-person consultation events taking place throughout the consultation period. There's no need to book an in-person event, but you do need to register for the online webinars. The most important thing is that you give us your feedback. Your feedback will be used to help shape our final proposals. For example, you may tell us that it would be advantageous to move a route slightly to avoid a noise-sensitive area that we're not aware of, or a boundary of controlled airspace would benefit from a lateral change to better suit a visual reference point. All your feedback will be considered by us, and we will document this process so you can understand how your feedback has been considered as part of the final proposals. We do need you to submit your feedback online. To do that, you need to go to our online survey shown at the link at the top of this page and answer the questions. You don't have to answer all the questions if you don't want to, and there is room for free text to tell us anything you can think of that is relevant. In the meantime, if you have any questions or require any further information, please get in touch with us via the email dsa-airspaceconsultation@flydsa.com. There's also a phone number, or you can write to us at this address. You must submit your feedback by midnight on Sunday the 4th of October 2026. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and respond.